with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Okay. So as I said, this is going to be a course entitled The Marriage Law of the Church, or MLC, which is an in-depth introduction to the matrimonial law of the church. I say in-depth because there are many ways of making an introduction, but since the end in view of this particular course is to enable you to be pre-judicial marriage counselors, pre-judicial marriage counselors, you need more than just a, shall we say, a superficial view or introduction. You should have enough matrimonial law or knowledge of the matrimonial law of the church in you by the end of the course that you will be able to spot whether there are grounds for initiating a case of nullity of marriage, and help the prospective litigants or the party concerned to write a case history and to prepare what you call a petition or a bill of complaint. Okay? So with that in mind, first let me introduce the course itself. Oops, let me see. Why can't I move it forward? Doesn't seem to want to move. There. This course was first introduced by an institute called the Asian Institute for Marriage and Family, which is really like an umbrella organization for different, shall we say, programs or apostolic initiatives. The two oldest programs were a pre-Cana program, which was called Cana 101, followed by a course which could be presented as a pre-Cana or also as a family counseling program, which in the language of CBCP is called Cana 102. It's the Beyond I Do kind of program. So that had been going on there for almost 10 years already in the Magallanes parish. And then on my own, I had also been doing things on canon law, and precisely with the initiative or the opening created by Pope Francis in his encyclical, not Familiaris Consortio, but rather Amoris Laetitia, to put up this kind of service in the parishes, the accompaniment of families, especially dysfunctional families. Then I put up this MLC course. Later on, there will be another course for those who have graduated in MLC to help those people who really are interested, who have become pre-judicial marriage counselors, to become advocates in the actual matrimonial process for the declaration of nullity of marriage. Okay, so that's one section, the canon law section or the canon law desk. And there's even an AIM-FAM law office, which are just a pool of the prejudicial marriage counselors with my, shall we say, counseling, or with my own direction, so that they can help prospective clients for the marriage tribunal of the church. And then you have another section, which is family counseling. They're supposed to do psych eval and counseling and carry out other modules to help couples, especially young couples. We're specifically targeting the first 5 years of marriage, where most of the problems come. And it's called Family Matters. And family finances, how to deal with in-laws, family visioning, well, also a little bit of um, psychology, how to for people to understand from the very beginning that men and women are not the same psychologically, so to avoid problems that can crop up because of that. Originally, those were the three sections, but then it came to our attention, or we became aware that many problems happen even before the pre-Cana stage. I'm not talking only of the pre-Cana in terms of the formation of people who are engaged. That if we really want to help people have not only good engagements but good families afterwards, we have to start forming them even before the time that they have courted or they are engaged, and that gave rise to the fourth section, which is the we call it wildfire, which are the shall we say, seminars and symposia organized for high schoolers and even grade schoolers. Chastity and love talks and things like that, chastity and marriage. And then we have a research desk, supposedly to come up with publications or whatever little research we may have done in the process. So this is what Asian Institute for Marriage and Family is. And this is one of the co-sponsors of this project, because the other co-sponsor is the Archdiocese of Cubao, or rather the Diocese of Cubao, which from the very beginning had been very helpful in organizing these things, especially the canon law section. I don't want to speak for the judicial vicar of the Diocese of Cubao. One of these days you will get a chance to meet him. But between the two of us, we have, shall we say, we are cherishing a dream of putting up some kind of an institute for Cubao also, something similar to the Asian Institute for Marriage and Family, but just focused on canon law. Precisely the formation of the advocates that I hope in the future will really be a project of that institute. And I don't know what other things can happen once this person, his name is Father Arvi, comes back from Rome, because right now he's doing his doctorate. He's a young priest, but with a lot of dreams, big dreams for helping canon law, is starting from Cubao. Because whatever we do in Cubao can later on go to other things. Okay, so without further ado, if I have introduced the, shall we say, the protagonist behind this course, not protagonist, because the protagonist behind this course would be you and me, but rather the sponsors behind this course. Now let's proceed to the course itself. Why a course on matrimonial law for prejudicial marriage counselors? This all stems from number 307 of Amoris Laetitia, that document that I mentioned earlier, which is a landmark document of Pope Francis, something that will most probably stand in the same level as Humanae Vitae of Pope Paul VI and Familiaris Consortia of St. John Paul II, is Amoris Laetitia, which is an extensive document on conjugal love and marriage. And because number 307 clearly stated the, shall we say, the goal of pastoral care for marriage and families as follows. First, to propose the fullness of the ideal of marriage, the fullness of the ideal of marriage. It's amazing. Many people are getting married, but not very many people really understand what marriage is. And very many just understand it as, two people romantically linked with each other and wanting to put the imprint of legality or of permanence to that particular relationship. Well, it's much more than that. So that's the first thing, propose the fullness. And then second, care for the functioning marriages, the actual marriages that are existing, how to care for them so that they last, so that they really attain their end, so that the families that ensue are stable, etc., etc. And then always very much the style of Pope Francis III is to accompany dysfunctional or problematic marital relations. So I wouldn't say marriages, because not necessarily marriages, because if they're dysfunctional, maybe they're not even marriages, they're just phenomena of people coming together. No? So how to accompany them properly. As we read in a document that came from the Roman Rota, it says there that the first step, let me just remove this. The first step that the bishops are called to take is that of creating a service of information, of counseling, and of mediation attached to the office of the family pastoral service, which would be able to receive persons in view of an eventual preliminary investigation for the matrimonial process. So in principle, every parish should have something like that. But at the very least, that every diocese should have a functioning office that can entertain problems of marriage. Now, this service, it continues, within the pastoral care of marriage, whether at the diocesan or at the parochial level, will underscore the pastoral solicitude of the bishop and of the parish priests towards the faithful who, after the failure of their marriage, question the existence or non-existence of their marriage bond. It's sad to say that there are many dysfunctional marriages. They're not the majority, much less. They're the minority, but considering that there are so many people who get married, there are so many families, what do you call this, Philippines has a big population. So the cases actually of really problematic marriages are not small. And many times people don't know how to handle them. And this is what we're trying to address here. This is what that document of the Pope and this document of the Roman Rota is trying to address. So the aim of prejudicial marriage counseling, the prejudicial marriage counseling ministry, is as follows. One, to regularize irregular family situations by examining the possibility of seeking the declaration of nullity of an irreparably broken previous canonical marriage of either or both spouses, and to proceed to the celebration of a valid canonical marriage for the existing and functioning union. In other words, as far as I'm concerned in the family life ministry, and more specifically the prejudicial marriage counseling ministry, we're not interested in helping people in dysfunctional marriages, or shall we say problematic marriages, to break it apart. What we're interested in is to help those problematic marriages weather or get through the problem and make their marriage work. What we're really interested in is how to help dysfunctional marital relations or irregular marital conditions. And let me illustrate this. Once in a while, well, more often than not, you meet couples, you meet family situations where it seems like they're a good Christian family, Catholic family. They go to church, the children are in Catholic schools, they go to church on Sunday, the children go to communion, the parents may even be part of the parochial organization there somewhere. And then you notice that the parents don't go to communion. How come? Well, they're not going to communion because a little investigation shows that they're not married pala. No? They're not married. But they're a good family, religious. They go to mass. The children are in Catholic schools, but the parents are not married. Why aren't they married? Because one of them, normally is the guy, a long time ago when he was an irresponsible teenager or a very young adult, got married. Got married without thinking properly. We're talking about a 20, 21, 22, or even 25-year-old who got married with very little preparation. And of course, that marriage broke up after a few years. perhaps even just 1 year. And it was forgotten. It was just there in the past. And now, when he's 30, he has matured. He meets the right person, and they have gotten married civilly, not in church, because he's still married in church. And now they have children, and the children are growing up, and they're growing up properly. Now, how to help this couple get married in church? Because it would be nice if they also got married in church, but one of them can't. As I said, normally it's the guy because of a previously failed marriage. Now, that's the marriage we want to investigate. That's the marriage that the prejudicial marriage counselor hopefully can look into to see if there are grounds, canonical grounds, legal grounds for having that marriage declared null from the very beginning, and open the door, therefore, for this functioning union to be regularized, to be legalized through a canonical marriage. Okay, but for that, the prejudicial marriage counselor needs a basic knowledge of matrimonial law. And this is what this course is all about. So, course objectives. At the end of this course, the students will be able to, one, explain the nature of Christian marriage and its juridic structure. Second, identify, understand, and recognize the causes of canonical nullity of marriage. Three, compare and contrast the causes of civil nullity of marriage and the canonical nullity of marriage, because those are two different things. You know, once in a while, people will ask this question. You'll meet this question yourselves, that if I get an annulment in church, that's what they call it. Later on, we'll correct that notion of an annulment. If I get an annulment in church, do I automatically get an annulment civilly also? Well, no, those are two different processes that have to be started, because these are two different legal systems: the canon law of the church and civil law of the state. When a person gets married, he gets married both as a member of the church within canon law, and also gets married as a member of the Republic of the Philippines. So he has to get married civilly also. For example, just to illustrate this again, you have seen many weddings in church, at the end of which they sign documents, right? Now, those documents that they're signing, they're not church documents. There are no church documents to sign. The only documentation of that marriage is done by the priest by putting it in the parish registry of marriage registry. That document that you're signing in church, that's the civil document. That's the civil contract, which you got from City Hall and which will be refiled in City Hall afterwards. You see, those are two different systems. When you file for a declaration of nullity in one or the other, it will only be valid for that particular forum or that particular system. Okay, so compare and contrast the causes of civil nullity of marriage and canonical nullity, because they're not the same. Understand the canonical processes for obtaining a declaration of nullity, because it's a process. Not because somebody thinks, I think my marriage was null after all because I wasn't thinking properly. Well, that's what you think. The law precisely has ways to ascertain that, and that's what we will look into when we look into what we call the juridic structure of marriage. Then distinguish between the ordinary process and the so-called briefer process, because Pope Francis introduced a fast-track process for getting a declaration of nullity, which, if done properly, can really be fast. As in, I think I hold the record for such a process. And I know that I have gone through a process like that. The fastest is 2 weeks. Then distinguish between, then finally, to be able to draft a bill of complaint and case history for a petition for declaration of marriage nullity. In other words, the proof of the pie is in the eating, right? So therefore, if all of these theories, all of these classes, you should know how to help a person file for a process for the declaration of nullity. You can't get into the process yourselves, because in order to do that, you have to be an advocate. But that's precisely what that course that I'm envisioning to organize, to put up with Father Arvi in Cubao, in the Diocese of Cubao, to help form marriage advocates or advocates for the matrimonial process for the declaration of nullity. Okay, so with that introduction, let's go to class 1. The natural structure of marriage. Marriage in reality. What is marriage? 3 things we have to look into. That marriage is the institutional expression, so in other words, the institutionalization of conjugal love. Second, what are the ends of marriage? The so-called tria bona, the 3 goods of marriage as envisioned by St. Augustine. And then third, because of those ends, the essential properties of marriage, which are monogamy, indissolubility, and fecundity or openness to life. Let's go to the first thing. Conjugal love. We said that marriage is nothing but the institutional expression of conjugal love. So if we're going to affirm that it's the institutional expression of conjugal love, we have to understand what conjugal love is. And here is where the cookie crumbles. The objection of the bishops to the sex education as envisioned by the RH law framers was the reduction of marriage to sex. Or for saying that, also the reduction of love to sex. If we say that marriage is the institutional expression of conjugal love, then we have to ask ourselves, what is conjugal love? It's love. Yeah, but what kind of love? Intuitively, you will already think that conjugal love, the love which is proper of marriage, is different from a simple love of friendship between 2 guys or 2 girls, or even a guy and a girl who are in a friendly relationship. They hold each other dear. They could even be soulmates sometimes. They think that, but it's not conjugal love. Conjugal love is a very specific kind of love. And it is the fundamental reality underlying marriage and the family. So what is conjugal love? Conjugal love is the mutual self-giving and acceptance of a man and a woman in the totality of their personhood, precisely as man and as woman, aimed at the perfection of that personhood in all its dimensions. Let's dissect that. It's the mutual self-giving. So it's not the mutual taking, but mutual giving of the self. You cannot give the other, right? You can only give yourself. I give myself, she gives herself. If it's mutual, then that's the first part of conjugal love. But okay, love of friendship can be also a mutual self-giving, but it's not yet conjugal love. What makes conjugal love, or what makes conjugal love conjugal precisely, is the second part, that they're giving each other and accepting each other precisely as man and as woman. In the totality of their personhood, you can even stop there and that won't be conjugal love. I gave myself totally to you. Yeah, but if I'm not giving myself totally as man, and I'm giving myself totally as man to you as woman, and vice versa, you're giving yourself totally to me as woman, and I'm accepting you as a man would accept you as a woman, then that's not conjugal love either. And all of this for the perfection of their personhood as man and as woman in all its dimensions. Now, this needs a little bit more of getting into. So what's so special about a person giving himself, or a man giving himself as man, and a woman giving herself as woman? Think about it a little and you realize that the only thing is special about a man as man and a woman as a woman is something sexual. Otherwise, it would be just person, period. What's different between me giving myself as a person in general and as a man in specifically is precisely the sexual part of it. Now, while it's true that we cannot reduce conjugal love to sex, it's also true that without sex, there can be no conjugal love. it will be a love of friendship, period, of two persons as persons, not two persons as man and as woman, respectively. Okay? So then, that conjugal love, and there's a thing here, conjugal. Why conjugal? Conjugal comes from Latin, con meaning one with, jugum. Jugum is yoke, not yoke, joke. Yoke, Y-O-K-E, yoke. You know, it's the yoke that you put on top of a team of horses or a team of oxen. So to be conjugal means you're carrying the same yoke, you're carrying the same burden. So that's what conjugal love is. It's a kind of love that's kind of burdensome. Now, why is that kind of burdensome, that kind of love? Precisely because of the ends that we will study afterwards. Because the end of conjugal love is one, mutual help, to help each other develop in the fullness of his and her personality, and that's a burden. To help someone develop means to sacrifice yourself, means many times to forego your own interest, your own selfishness, to help the other. That's why I always correct people when they say, but marriage is a give and take. No, it's not. Marriage is a give and give. You don't take in marriage. You don't take in conjugal love. You just give. The thing is, if it's mutual, then the other person gives himself or herself to you, in which case you don't need to take, you receive. So rather than the give and take relationship, it's more of a give and receive relationship. But then, since it's a self-giving and acceptance in the totality of their personhood as man and as woman, masculinity and femininity, maleness and femaleness, are naturally configured, meaning to say nature puts it, such that when they're given totally to each other, it has an intrinsic fruitfulness. In other words, sexuality, sexual intercourse has a natural, shall we say, a tendency towards the procreation of offspring. Now, in the human species, the procreation of offspring is not like in the animal species, much less like the vegetables, that they just reproduce. No, among men, what comes out is so fragile, takes so long to mature, not only physically, but also spiritually, that it really is a burden to do that thing. Animals, when they reproduce, especially when you look at those animals that have many offspring, fishes, for example, it's not much of a burden. No? The fishes come out and that's it. They're swimming by themselves. They have to fend for themselves. But for man, no. We have to take care of our offspring one by one. That's the reason why normally there are not multiple pregnancies, but single pregnancies, right? And if you have a twin or a triplet, that's already a big deal because of this burden. So family then is a natural fruit of conjugal love. With that, traditionally, this comes all the way from the Middle Ages. When I say Middle Ages, the times of St. Augustine in the 5th century, already theologians and philosophers had already recognized that there are three, shall we say, ends of conjugal love and of marriage, which is the institution that expresses it. These are natural ends. In other words, that love, which is natural for man, naturally has these ends. In the same way that you say, for example, that naturally we eat, naturally we need to sleep, naturally we grow, naturally. So that's what it means. You cannot eat and not get nourished. You cannot live and not sleep. You cannot sleep and not get rested afterwards. Sometimes people sleep and they're not rested. That's precisely an abnormality. That's an anomaly. That normally it's not like that. That's what we mean by nature. That the Creator organized things, configured human persons this way. Now, this conjugal love, it has three ends. One, the good of fidelity, bonum fide in Latin. reducible to the good of the spouses, the bonum conjugum. Why is that such a good? Think about it. No? Isn't it a good that two people give themselves totally to each other and accept each other mutually in a way that is exhaustive, meaning to say they exhaust that capacity to give themselves to each other that way with just one partner because it's total. No? I cannot give myself totally and have something left over to give to another person. So that's what this means. No? If it's total self-giving, then there's nothing left over. But here's the thing. How do you guarantee that that thing will happen? That you give each other and really it won't be wasted, and that's what fidelity means. Okay, so the good of fidelity, that Christian or marriage, not even Christian marriage period, is that natural relationship that is configured in such a way that the self-giving of two people is not wasted because it's faithful. Second, the good of offspring. Again, human nature is configured in such a way that when a man and a woman give themselves mutually to each other, not in anything else, but in the totality of their being as man and as woman, then there's that intrinsic, inherent potentiality, capability for procreation, for the giving of offspring. And again, that's a good called the good of offspring, the bonum prole, thereby making marriage, conjugal love, and the family the cradle of humanity. Without that, then there can be no human reproduction, there can be no growth or even survival of the species. And then finally, you have a third good, and this is specific for Christian marriage. That among the baptized, Christ elevated that natural phenomenon of marriage, elevated it so that it has become a sacrament. Now, what does that mean? That among the baptized, that reality of conjugal love becomes, as it were, the visible sign, that's a symbol, therefore, that God makes use of to give his grace for the growth of the person. You have heard of sacraments. What are sacraments? Baptism, confirmation, the Holy Eucharist, etc. What are they? If you remember your fundamental catechism that you memorized as children, a sacrament is defined as a visible sign, so therefore it's something visible, palpable, instituted by Christ, not by anybody else. Only Christ could institute the sacraments. That's why what he has instituted, we cannot add anymore. There, he instituted 7, and 7 they will remain. A visible sign instituted by Christ to give grace. It becomes a channel for grace. In other words, for the Christian, that reality of conjugal love, which has these goods of mutual help, the fidelity, and the procreation of children, in itself becomes an avenue for God to give his grace, to help a person realize his full potentiality as a child of God. That's another way of saying that marriage as a sacrament, marriage for a Christian, is a way to be holy, is a way to become a better person, is a way to become a saint. And again, a little bit of thinking will show you that's true. Marriage, if it doesn't make you a saint, I don't know what else will. For those who are married, they really, it's a school of sacrifice, a school of service, it's a school of selflessness. It's a school of love, precisely, conjugal love. And later on, the love of paternity. No? Okay. Now, if those are the ends of marriage, then the institution proper to foster those ends must have certain characteristics or qualities. The end is what identifies a thing, but then its qualities depend on those ends. What are the characteristics, what are the qualities that will best enable an institution or an operation, an activity, achieve those ends of marriage? And here we go to the essential properties of marriage. essential. These were not invented by the church. These are not legislated by any human power. It's essential for whatever is going to achieve those ends of marriage. And these are, first, monogamy. That conjugal love, if it's really going to accomplish its end of mutual help, is exhausted with one person. As I said earlier, you can only give yourself totally to one person. There will be nothing left over to give to another one. Any attempt to do otherwise, and that's what polygamy is, ends up diluting conjugal love. I mean, again, any bit of experience, even just reading about it, will make you realize that in those societies where polygamy is allowed, for example, a man with several wives, quote unquote, several partners, you know very well that he cannot love them as much as he could love one. It's diluted. We're finite. Only God can love everyone infinitely. But we can only love finitely. And if you start dividing that finite thing, and then, of course, it will be diluted, right? And in those societies where you have several wives, you have all kinds of stories precisely about the injustices or even the cruelty committed on the other wives because of one or two or whatever. So monogamy. And then indissolubility, another essential quality of conjugal love, because if love is total self-giving, then it must be permanent. In other words, I cannot give myself and take it back. There's a difference. There's the difference between giving and borrowing and lending, rather. When you give, you're gonna take it back. It's not yours anymore. So that's what indissolubility means. True love has no expiry date. That's why divorce is wrong. You know, somebody was crazy enough to file a bill in Congress to make, not only to institute divorce, they keep on refiling that bill. Somebody actually filed a bill to make marriage, give marriage an expiry date. No, I want to get married. It's like getting your license, no, or your passport, 10-year passport or a 15-year passport. So a 10-year marriage, etc., etc. That doesn't know what he's talking about. Because love, can you imagine if you say, I love you? And if a person cannot say that he loves forever, but he only loves until while it lasts, no, good as this, as long as supply lasts, as they say, no. Well, no, love must be indissoluble. And finally, it must be open to life. As we mentioned earlier, the self-giving of a man and a woman, as man and as woman, that means to say, therefore, sexual intercourse by itself is naturally oriented towards fertility. Whether or not actual conception or actual, what do you call this, procreation happens, depends on God, because God is the one who creates the soul, right? But in itself, the physical part of it, the human part of it in itself should be open to procreation. So to attempt to contradict that, and that's what contraception is also wrong. It's also immoral. That's why contraception is wrong. That's another reason for the objection to the family planning program, to the birth control program instituted by the government, because they include among the options for family planning contraception. And that's not an option. It's like, inviting the people to go into all kinds of micro industries or all kinds of economic activity. But then for the financing, you tell them, well, okay, you can go get a loan from window 3 of DBP, or you can also rob a bank. Wait a minute, that's not an option, no? Because that's wrong. That's not an option. It should not be included among the options. That's why the family planning program of the government should not include contraception, because it's a non-option. It's wrong. Hmm? Only good options are real options. The others are crimes, are aberrations. They're immoral behavior or unethical behavior. And whatever is not ethical should not be an option. So those are the natural ends and the essential properties of marriage. This is the natural structure of marriage. It's not subject to human restructuring, the same way that human nature is not subject to re-engineering. You know, sometimes you hear of scientists getting into things, research, like the Human Genome Project, for example, no? Looking at the possibility of re-engineering the DNA so that a human person can have desirable qualities. Like what? Well, I don't know. No, I mean, more resistant to sickness, certain sickness, or even foreseeing the possibility of irregularities, how to prevent that in order to perfect human nature. There's nothing wrong with that, because you understand what human nature is. If something will enable you to breathe better, to grow better, to resist disease better, well, all of those are good. Well, what if you try to re-engineer precisely the human body such that it goes beyond human nature? Like what? Well, I don't know. Like what they're trying to do now, no, to make certain operations so that a boy becomes a girl and vice versa. What happened to my slide? There. Well, that's something wrong, because that's not human nature. By nature, men and women are the only two possibilities for the human species, just like all the other members of the animal kingdom. No? You're either male or female. And to do otherwise is contra naturam, is against nature, or not even praeter naturam, outside of nature, but against it. It's against the design of the Creator. And when you do things like that, then again, you enter the realm of the unethical and the immoral. What canon law and civil law has done is to express this reality in juridic terms so that it can be protected and enforced. And this is what is meant by the juridic structure of marriage, which is the topic of the next class. So we still have 5 minutes, and I'm ready to entertain questions if somebody wants to ask a question. So the floor is open to an open forum.
Father, there's a question in the chat box.
Okay.
Having offspring is not anymore quote unquote good because then that how do we explain?
Okay. You know, it's very easy to say that having offspring is no longer good, but says who? Can that statement be defended logically? Because that's a very facile statement to say. Because on the contrary, precisely what I'm saying is having children is good. It's the good of marriage. And the simplest way of understanding that is two things. Number one is the way sex is designed. That activity, sexual intercourse, has a natural result, which is the fertilization of the egg, and the outcome of that is the coming about of a new human being, if God puts in the soul, so that there's real fertilization. So that's the natural structure of human sexuality. So if you don't want that, then don't get into sex. But since sex is something that you can only get into within marriage, then you have to get married to get into that activity. And secondly is, even that thing of, it's not anymore good to have children. On what grounds? Not on the grounds of nature, but rather on the grounds of economics, social condition, etc., etc. But then that opens itself to a whole lot of discussion afterwards. No? Yes. Is there anything else in the chat box?
Yes, Father. First, Father, there's a request. Please put your screen on slideshow mode so that they could read what's written
Mm,
on the slide to present. I guess to present it, Father. And
yes.
then, Father, yes. And then there's a question: how extensive is the advocate's participation in the church marriage nullity process?
There. How extensive is the participation
And
of?
sige, sige, Father. Yan muna.
Because the minute I put it in this mode, then I lose the. Oh, wait a minute. Can I go to the chat box? No, I don't see the chat box. So can you just please read it to me, Chrissy?
Yeah. Which one? Which one? What, Father?
The
The Well, okay, there was a question. How extensive is the advocate's participation in the church's annulment process?
okay.
And then after that, there's another question from someone else.
Let me answer that first. How
Sige, sige,
extensive
Father.
the participation of the advocate? Now, the advocate. Okay, let's put it this way. You all are familiar with processes, right? I mean, you've seen the movies. You know, when you go to a tribunal, who are the people that are acting in a tribunal? You have the judge, and then you have the two parties. But the two parties normally don't say things. The ones who say things for them are their advocates, their lawyers. In other words, no, because the lawyers are the ones who know the juridic structure of things, the legalities of things, so that what a normal person can say actually has to be said a different way in a court of law. And maybe it shouldn't even be said, but other things should be said instead, etc., etc. Now, in the church, there are very few advocates. In the Philippines, there are none at the moment for matrimonial tribunals. So imagine going to a process where there are no lawyers. It's just a judge. Can that be done? Of course, it can be done, but it will take so much time, and that's precisely what happens many times with the church procedure. No, now if they're advocates, then what they can do is okay. Let me retrace this. Without the advocates, then what will happen in that process? Then the judge will have to do everything. The instruction of the case, only the judge will have to instruct it. Instruct is to investigate the case, to get out the proofs from the evidence. Not only the judge will do it. And then worse, then he will have to study the case and write out the sentence. And you don't just write out the sentence with a conclusion. You write out a sentence with all the description of the case, then the so-called inure, the law behind it, and then the argument after it. He will have to do all of that. When there's an advocate, what does the advocate do? He can prepare, actually, the prejudicial marriage counselor is capable of doing this also, already prepare the case, I mean, the outline of the case, the story of the case, so to speak. And then, very important, already put the law part of it. No? The law says this, and then can even argue it already. And so therefore, since the law says this is what happened, the law says this, then therefore we can see that this is null. All of that can be in what you in the lawyers know is called the pleadings of the case. So that the judge, normally, if the pleadings are good, can almost cut and paste to come up with a sentence. Now, what happens in churches, since there's no advocate, the poor judge has to do everything. Now, so if you're asking me, what would be the role of the advocate? What I said. He will help in the writing of the history properly. He will put the juridic, the legal background, the legal basis for what it is they're claiming that it was null, and then he will argue the case, applying the law to that particular case, so that you arrive at the conclusion that it is null. So then all the judge has to do is really look at it. So that's what an advocate does. Okay. So what is the next question?
If family is the fruit of conjugal love, is a childless couple considered a family?
Yes. Hmm? A childless couple is a family. For as long as they're having conjugal love, they're exercising their self-giving, or they're giving themselves to each other and accepting each other fully, then they're a family.
Mm.
A
And
childless.
then, yeah, there's another question. If all possible workups were done by the childless couple, can they proceed to artificial insemination or even implantation?
Okay, that's not exactly part of this course,
Mm.
but the answer to that, since that's a valid question and I'm perfectly capable of answering it, the answer to that is no. For the simple reason that the dignity of the human person is such that every human person must be the result of conjugal love. No? So, in other words,
Mm.
there's a one to one correspondence between conjugal love and a human person. So, a human person cannot be the result of a technical manipulation or technological manipulation in a laboratory for putting together sperm and egg. Because if that were the case, then if that child later on were ever to ask, how did you come into life? How did you come to be? He should be able to answer, by the love of my mother and my father. They're coming together. No, he's going to say, because a lab technician put sperm and egg together. I mean, that's the meaning of the dignity of the human person. The end is the same, but the means is wrong. And since the means do not justify the end, or the ends do not justify the means, he cannot have that end of a new human person through an artificial means. Another way of saying this is just a different, slightly different angle. In order for procreation to happen, remember that's the word procreation. It's not reproduction. Human reproduction is a misnomer. Animals reproduce, vegetables reproduce, but human beings, they procreate. You see? Why? Because precisely it's a contribution, it's a collaboration between the parents and God. The parents putting the physical aspect of it, sperm and egg, and God putting in the soul, the soul. Now, since on the part of God, everything that he does out of love, then the coming together with sperm and egg must also be an act of love. Love of whom? Of the lab attendant or the technician who puts it together in the laboratory in vitro fertilization? No. The coming together of sperm and egg must be the result of what technically is called the marital embrace, the sexual intercourse of husband and wife. If sperm and egg come together, not as an act of love of husband and wife, because it can also happen that sperm and egg come together because of the action of a man and a woman, but precisely not motivated by conjugal love, an act of violence, for example, or an act of bondage or whatever other act you may be, then that's also wrong. That every human person must be the result of the conjugal love of his parents. If it's outside of that, it's wrong.
Mm. Okay. There's another question, Father. If monogamy is an essential property of marriage, how come the Muslims think otherwise? It seems that Allah allows it. Please comment.
Okay? Because even in the Old Testament, or even in the time of Jesus, some Jews already told him, no, that Moses told us that if a man wants to leave his wife, let him write a writ of divorce and get on with it. And what did Jesus Christ say? He did that because of the hardness of your heart. Because in the Jewish system, if a man did not like the wife for whatever reason, no, he could dismiss her, just write a divorce, or just saying three times with witnesses, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, then they're divorced. But that's precisely the old dispensation, fruit of human perfidy, of the weakness of human nature, that Jesus Christ perfected by his coming. That's why he said, but it was not like that from the very beginning. In other words, Adam and Eve before the fall were not doing that. It's only after the fall that they did that. And all these centuries thereafter are a concession to human perfidy. But precisely with his coming, he changed it. So that from now on, if you do that, then you're doing wrong.
Yeah.
Okay?
And actually, Islam came after Christianity.
Precisely.
In history. Yeah.
Okay.
Another question about the duty of the prejudicial marriage counselor. Does it involve those unions which are already hopeless, or do they still try to resolve the irregularities?
Okay. As I said, unions which are already hopeless, those are the ones that are there. Because when you say hopeless, to be hopeless, functionally hopeless, practically hopeless, the break must already have happened. While the two are still together, that's not hopeless. That's still possible. No? And that's the reason why I said that the prejudicial marriage counselor, our interest is not to help people who are still together break it up. If they're still together, we should help them patch it up and make it work. They're still together. Now, what we're interested in are those which have already broken and even broken up for many years already. And that there we can see that that's hopeless. Then the next best thing we can do, since we cannot make them come together, is to investigate whether that separation, that break, can be declared legal. Because maybe, just think about this. If a marriage, what was thought of as a marriage, took place in church, before witnesses, and they really tried with the help of the priest, with the help of spiritual direction, or with the help of what they thought was a sacrament. If despite all that, it still didn't work, then you have to entertain the possibility maybe there was something wrong from the very beginning. And that's exactly what the course for declaration of nullity is. If a marriage, a union, breaks despite all the help, then maybe there was no marriage. So that's what I call a non-marriage. So what the prejudicial marriage counselor will do now, and what the tribunal of the church will do, is to investigate that and to see for what reason was it not valid. Because most probably it really wasn't. I remember Archbishop Cruz many years ago saying, "What God has put together, let no man or no men put asunder." But then he said, with a twinkle in his eye, "But what God has not put together, let no man force together." This is what happens with those marriages which are invalid from the very beginning. Everybody thought they were valid. That's why they were together. Even the priest thought it was valid. That's why it was celebrated in church. And only years after you discover, there was something wrong. And then you conclude, no wonder it didn't work. No wonder they broke apart. But unless they have broken apart, then you should not even think that. You only think that when they have broken. And even in church procedure, a process or a cause for declaration of nullity is not admitted until there has been enough time of break so that you can really say that what do you call this? It cannot be fixed anymore. That the reconciliation is already impossible. That the break has become irreversible. Then you start investigating why. Why did it break? And then you just might find out because there was no marriage to begin with. Okay. Okay, we have to end this class now, and we'll take a 5-minute break, and we'll proceed to the next class. Okay?
Yeah. Okay, there's another question on IVF, Father. In relation to IVF, it is the love of the couple that made them decide to go through the process, and most probably the reason to go through artificial means is health reason. Does that still make it invalid? Would it be the same with surrogacy?
Okay. To answer questions like that, you have to have enough, shall we say, moral background or knowledge of ethics. Because one thing is the motive, another thing is the action in itself. Just think about this. There are many actions. Think of any act, any action, any act. it's motivated by several things. But the motivation is not the same as the action. The action in itself has to be analyzed, isolated, and judged.
Mhm.
You can have the best of intentions. Of course, IVF, for example, I don't think anyone will go to IVF with not loving children. Oh, okay, fine. Let's correct that, because somebody may go to IVF precisely just to harvest tissues afterwards and to harvest antibodies and things like that. So in other words, instrumentalizing human reproduction to be a source for raw materials for whatever medicinal purposes. That can happen, but that's an extreme case, right? Although precisely, you see, if you admit that kind of argument, that for as long as the motivation is good, then the action can be justified. The next step is to go into something like this. The action must be isolated. And what is the action in IVF? It's not the motivation of love. That's what motivated that action. The action in IVF is what? Think. Is the lab attendant or the lab technician putting together a suspension of semen, in other words, sperm that has been washed, into some eggs that have been harvested from the woman, also washed and in saline solution in a petri dish. That is the act. Now, is that act good or bad? Not the act of the parents. That's a different act. Because really, if you think about it, what are the acts of the parents? Well, I tell you what the acts of the parents are. The man, what did he do? He masturbated to harvest semen. And the woman, what did he do? She allowed herself to be injected with FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, to stimulate the maturation and the release of several eggs at any given time instead of just one every 28 days. So that's what happens in IVF. So they harvest several eggs. The man normally masturbates and they get the semen, and then it's brought to the lab, and then the technician there puts this thing. So those are the individual acts there. The act of masturbation, is that good or bad? Regardless of whatever motivation he may have. Of course it's wrong. The woman allowing multiple eggs to be harvested from her. At the very best, it's kind of instrumentalizing her capacity to produce eggs. And definitely the technician there who's doing this procedure in the lab, I don't know what he's doing. No, it's like I would put him, he's the equivalent of a butcher or at least a chef putting together ingredients to come up with pizza. Hmm? That's not the way a human person is supposed to come about. You see? And that's only those acts. If you really want to talk about IVF, I can talk to you more things about the IVF, more acts involved in IVF. Because what are the other acts involved? Which normally people who go into IVF do not know about until they're already in the facility, have invested money to go to Singapore or to go to St. Luke's. And what are the other things? The other things are as follows. Number one, as I said, when you inject FSH, you harvest several eggs. What are you going to do with all the eggs that you harvest? 6, 8, perhaps even 12 eggs at any given moment. Well, normally you will fertilize all of them because it's so easy. That's the easiest step in IVF, the fertilization of the harvested eggs, because there are millions of sperm cells anyway. So you just put them together, and all of those will be fertilized. So what do you have now? You have half a dozen, 8, or even a dozen embryos. Remember that an embryo is potentially a human being already. It's just an embryonic stage. All it needs is time, and it will become Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so. But the thing is, people have a way of depersonalizing the embryo such that it's just there. It's something microscopic. Okay, fine. Now what do you do with all of that? Normally, when you're already in the facility, they will ask you to sign a waiver, what to do with the excess embryo. And what are the options? Number one, donate for experimentation, donate to science. Number two, destroy, throw them away. Number three, cryopreservation, put it in the freezer. That's what happens. And you see there are several options there which are already wrong. But okay, fine. Then what the next step is implantation. What do they do with the embryos? Well, they put them in they don't actually put them in the uterus. They put them in the fallopian tube so that it can travel naturally towards the uterus. It takes 4, 5, 6 days for that trip to happen. You don't put it in the fallopian tube inside. You put it the opening of the fallopian tube, in your structures, the women there. By the way, most men don't know these things, by the way. It's funny, But anyway, you know very well that the end of the fallopian tube is an opening like that, so you put it there. Anyway, now what happens? Those embryos will implant. Again, there's a very high success rate in implantation. So you get 6, 7, 8 embryos implanting. Why did they put so many? And here's the thing. Because there is a synergy in implantation. So that implanting 2 is not just double the rate of 1. It will be 4. Implanting 3 is 9 times. It's a geometric rise in the success of that step if you put multiple implants. In other words, multiple pregnancies. Okay, so fine. So there you have there 5, 6, 7 siblings all implanted. They developed. But then in a given moment, and they're developing better because they're together. There's a synergy, there's positive synergy for multiple pregnancies. There's a negative synergy for deliveries. In other words, twins are not just double the risk of delivering. Triplet is not just triple the risk of delivering. It also rises geometrically. That's the reason why few women will agree on twins or much less triplets. So what do? At a certain number of weeks of development, they have to cull the siblings. I purposely call them siblings and not just other embryos because they are siblings. They're the brothers and sisters of each other. So what do? They suck them out. This abortion, right? In order to leave behind the healthiest sibling. So all the rest of the siblings sacrifice for the sake of their healthiest brother or sister. All of those are contained in IVF. And people don't talk about that because, of course, that's negative publicity. But ask when you do go to an IVF facility if these things are true, and you say that they are. Okay, but let's move from this topic because we have to go to the next topic. And I'd like a 5-minute break.
Yes, Father, there's another question.
Well, I cannot entertain it here. Just write it there, and I will.
It's in the chat box, Father. It's in the chat box.
Okay, I will answer it later. So let's call for a 5-minute break, and for me to also take water, and I'll return after 5 minutes for the second class. Okay? Thank you very much. Okay. What is this thing of juridic structure? To understand juridic structure, let's try to draw a comparison. Remember the film Matrix? Matrix. If you remember the story of Matrix, the fundamental argument, or shall we say, story was that there had come a time when human beings, human bodies, were being used as energy source, the so-called, what do you call that? Their cells, no? Like just in the same way that you have dry cells, well, you have cells, human cells, or animal cells for that matter, being used as a source of energy because next to nuclear energy, the most efficient fuel source or the source of energy is what you call the fuel source. What the living organism, the living cells, the amount of energy they can extract from chemicals is way more than what you can get in a lab by mixing together chemicals. Of course, a lot less than what would happen if you have nuclear fusion or fission. That's nuclear energy. But it's a very good source, by the way. Let me illustrate this. Have you ever wondered how far you can run on a banana? For those of you who are runners, I'm a runner, I'm a marathoner. So from with one banana, you can fuel a 5 kilometer run or even more. No? Imagine that's how much energy you can get from a simple banana or from a bar of chocolate, chocolates or of kicks, or what do you call them? Anyway, so that was the story there. They were using human bodies and extracting energy from them. But then the problem is, what human person will allow himself to be a source for energy, right? How do you keep the human body peaceful? You cannot just, put people in suspended animation, knock them in the head, and then connect them to a machine. No, they'll die. They have to be happily living, even in a artificial situation. And that's what happens there. All of those human bodies are connected to a computer, feeding information into their brains. Of course, that's fiction, right? That can really happen into their brains so that they're happy. They're living their lives out in the story that's in the Matrix, being that novel put together by that computer, so that they expend energy. So if the machine wants to get more energy, they put them into a run. They're being chased, for example, no? Or if there's a downtime, like what happens with Meralco during night, well, there's less demand for energy, then they put them to sleep and things like that. Okay, so that was the story. Now, I want you to remember that story because this is what happens with the juridic world. One thing is the real world, and another thing is the matrix that the law has made out of that world. Let's illustrate this with a concrete example of Juan de la Cruz. The real Juan de la Cruz, or any one of you who is a real person with your substance and with your accidents, as in philosophy it's called, no? Your being and all your characteristics. That's the ontological reality. That's the reality, that's the real person. But in the juridic world, there's a representation of that, which is not quite that. Because if you get the Juan de la Cruz, and if it doesn't have any of the juridic representations, if he's not entered in that matrix, then he doesn't exist. And what are the parameters, so to speak, that configure him as a real subject, a real entity in the juridic matrix? Well, for example, you have his age, proven by his birth certificate. And then you have his domicile. I haven't been using my pointer. How do I use my pointer? Zoom in, show, presenter view. I don't see any one of my pointers. Anyway, pointer options. There you are. Pointer options, laser pointer. There you are. Can you see my pointer now?
Yes, Father.
Now it's pointed at age.
No, Father. It's pointed under the ontological reality column.
That's right. I'm sorry. Uh, no, because I think that's a recording of a previous presentation. Pointer options, laser pointer, arrow options, visible. Now, can you see my arrow? No. Can you see my arrow now? I can't. Anyway, so what are the things that go into the juridic structure? One is you have age, proven by the birth certificate. Then you have his domicile. He lives somewhere. That's proven by his residence certificate. And then you have his citizenship. He's not just an alien in the planet, right? He belongs to a country, and that's shown by his passport. And then most probably has his academic status. He's a high school graduate or he's a university graduate, etc. So in which case he will have his diploma, and then he will have his civil status. Is he married or not? If he's married, then he will have a marriage certificate, and then you have his financial personality. So again, no, if you don't have a TAN, tax account number, then you're not a member of the financial system of the country. You don't exist as far as the BIR is concerned, as far as the banking system is concerned, as far as commerce is concerned. You don't exist, no. And then finally, your financial status. Maybe you have a bank account and things like that. And finally, you have all the other dynamic, shall we say, elements of your juridic personality, which are the contracts that you enter into. Now, all of those configure you as a subject, an element within that matrix, which I call the juridic matrix. And that gives you a reality in the juridic world. Without those, you may exist, really, ontologically. You're there, you're walking around. But as far as the civil law is concerned, you don't. You don't exist. Why? Because you're not registered anywhere. So that's what juridic world means, and that's what the juridic structure means. Now, we have to apply that to marriage. Marriage, the juridic structure of marriage, I always explain, rests on three pillars, because after all, we're talking about structure, right? How do you configure, how do you structure that reality of conjugal love expressed in that marriage between two people? How do you represent that in the juridic world? Even more important probably is, how do you protect that in the juridic world? Or another way of saying it is, how do you prove that that exists in the juridic world? Or vice versa, prove that it doesn't exist in the juridic world? Now, that structure of marriage, juridic structure, rests on three legs. One is the leg of capacity, another is the consent, and a third is the form. And we shall go over these things one by one. First is capacity. It's a tried enough remark that for you to do something, you must be capable of doing it, right? You cannot do anything that the law incapacitates you from doing. Even if actually you'll do it. For example, if you have a 15-year-old executing a contract to buy a car, he has the money, he executes a contract to buy a car. Did it happen? Yes. Does he have the money? Yes. You may even say, hey, there, he got the car, he's driving it around already. But that contract is invalid. No? In other words, if one day there's a problem, the owner of the car can get it back and even charge him for having stolen it. Why? Because there's no valid contract for the sale of that car to him. Why? Because he's not an adult. And in order to execute a valid contract like that, you have to be an adult, and he's not. So that's what I mean. No? To get married, you have to be legally capable of getting married. We'll go into that more later. And now is the later, I'm sorry. So the capacity to contract marriage. In principle, all human beings are capable of contracting marriage. Why? Think. Why are all human beings legally capable, juridically capable of contracting marriage? Because it's a natural institution. Human beings are made for that. Adam and Eve, the caveman, they were all getting married. No? It forms part. That's what we say when we say something is natural. It forms part of nature that man and woman are capable of getting married to each other. Except, and here's the exception, in those things where the law itself incapacitates them. And there are 12 plus one more, 13 of those specific peculiarities that the law says you are not capable of getting married. And what are those? First comes the so-called 12 impediments, which are specific personal situations that the law has defined, rendering the person incapable of contracting marriage. And when we look closer at them, later on, we will arrive at this conclusion. I'm just giving you a preview now. They're really nothing but protections of the so-called three goods of marriage. In other words, these are characteristics that renders a person incapable of achieving the three ends of marriage. Since the three ends of marriage are, what are they again? Fidelity, offspring, and then the good of the sacrament. Any characteristic of a person that will make it impossible for him or to accomplish those ends will mean that he shouldn't be able to get married because he cannot accomplish the end for which marriage is naturally configured, right? And then there's a third, there's a 13th thing, which is the so-called legal incapacity to fulfill the serious obligations of marriage. In other words, if a person intrinsically, because of a psychological anomaly, is incapable of fulfilling the essential obligations of marriage, then he cannot get married, validly, because he's incapable of delivering on what he is committing himself to. Okay? Now, the second leg is the so-called consent, which is the most important leg, because after all is said and done, what makes a marriage come about is the consent of the two parties to get married. They may be legally capacitated, they're perfectly able to pursue the ends of marriage, but if they don't want to get married, then there can be no marriage, right? That is expressed beautifully in Latin and in canon law when it says consent makes marriage. Consensus fit matrimonium. Canon 1057 of the Code of Canon Law expresses this. In paragraph 1, it says marriage is brought about through the consent of the parties, legitimately manifested between persons who are capable, according to law, of giving consent. No power can replace this consent. Yeah. Marriage is brought about through the consent of two parties, legitimately manifested. You see, that's the juridic structure, no? That what brings about marriage is the consent. But then canon law, the law says that for that consent to be juridically binding, it must be provable, so to speak. And the only way that it can be provable, it should be manifested, given, expressed between those two persons in the way the law has established it. They cannot do it secret. They can do it implied. They cannot do it, I don't know what other understanding. No, it must be expressed in the way that the law says so. And no power on earth can replace that consent. Without that consent legitimately manifested, there can be no marriage. Paragraph 2 of that same canon says matrimonial consent is an act of the will by which a man and a woman, through an irrevocable covenant, mutually give and accept each other in order to establish marriage. So it's an act of the will. It's not an act of the feeling. It's not even just an act of the intellect, a decision, a judgment that it's the right thing to do, that this is the right person for me. So I conclude that I should marry that person. She's the right person for me. Well, that's not consent. Consent is, therefore, I marry her. That's consent. And then the third is the form, the juridic form of the celebration of marriage. In other words, the actual formality, the actual procedure. You know, there was a time before the establishment of the so-called form that people were getting married anyway. No? If two people decide to get married to each other, they have, nowadays, for example, there's such a thing as an MU, mutual understanding. When two people are in an MU kind of relationship, they really love each other. They think so anyway. They might even say that they really are committed to each other. They can even die for each other. They have no intention of breaking apart. That's an MU. But okay, it's just an MU. They're not married, right? Because they haven't yet expressed that mutual understanding in a way accepted by law, such that it's legally binding, that they really have that understanding to be committed to each other. So this is what this means, no? That the consent might be there, there's a mutual understanding, but unless it's expressed in the proper form and in the proper form, witnessed by the desired number of people, required number of people rather, then there's no marriage. Okay? Now what happens? Canon 1108, paragraph 1, defines what this form is. Only those marriages are valid which are contracted in the presence of the local ordinary or the parish priest or a priest or deacon delegated by either of them who assist and in the presence of two witnesses. In other words, the so-called canonical form, the specific formality, external form that can be juridically verifiable for two people to consent to get married, is that the two must be there and they must express that consent in front of what you call a qualified witness, who is either the local ordinary, meaning to say the bishop, or their parish priest, or a priest or a deacon delegated by either the local ordinary or the parish priest. Okay, sidebar. If you notice, many times, especially here in the NCR, National Capital Region, people get married anywhere, right? Destination marriage even, or weddings. People from Green Meadows, they get married in Tagaytay and Calora, and etc., etc. Now, obviously, if you get married in another place, not your parish, then you're going to fall outside the first two, that witnessed by the local ordinary or by your parish priest. Now, the law provides you can be witnessed by another priest, provided they have the proper delegation from either your own bishop or your own parish priest. And that's a point very important, because without that delegation, then that marriage will be invalid for lack of the proper canonical form. Now, the one assisting at the marriage is understood to be only that person who, present at the ceremony, asks for the contractant's manifestation of consent. So who is the assisting priest, or who is the qualified witness? The one who asks for the consent, and the one witnessing the two people consenting to each other. Because remember, when two people get married in church, they're not consenting to the church, they're consenting to each other. So the church, in the person of that qualified witness, is just witnessing it. That's the reason why the terminology for it is a qualified witness. Not just any witness, but this is special witness who can witness for the church, who is either the local ordinary, the bishop, or the parish priest. And you see there already why the parish priest, because he's the one who knows that they're going through this validly or in the good use of their reason, and who knows them, etc., and knows that therefore there are no objections to this marriage, that this is going to be a valid marriage. So that's the reason for that. But aside from the qualified witness, two more witnesses, who can be anyone, That's the canonical form. Hmm? Sidebar. When you go to a wedding, normal church wedding, a canonical marriage, normally you see so many people there, right? So you have the bride and the groom, and then you have a whole entourage. The entourage, by the way, if you notice, is not the entourage of the wedding, it's the entourage of the bride, right? The poor guy has nobody there. Well, okay, he has his best man, etc. But okay, they have the entourage, but even more, so we say, attention, it catches our attention. The number of ninongs and ninangs who are there. No? Actually, the canonical form is that the priest, the sacred minister, who is either the bishop or the parish priest or any other priest or deacon delegated by the local ordinary or the parish priest, plus two more witnesses. If you add the couple, then you have 5 people. Those are the only people there who are required by law to be in that marriage. Excuse me. What happens with all the ninongs and the ninas, so-called ninongs and ninas, who, by the way, are not godparents. Godparents are for baptism and confirmation. These are sponsors. Sponsors for what? Do you need to sponsor a marriage? You see, not exactly. It's just for the social norms and practices. Normally, marriage have become more and more complicated. There's the reception. So these are the sponsors to help, to put it very bluntly, help defray the costs of a marriage. One would want to think that that's where the ninong and the ninang terminology comes in, that in a relatively healthy society like the Philippines, the couple want to look up to the example of their sponsors, so that they call them ninong and ninang. In the same way, in a parallel way to the duty of the real ninong and ninang for the baptized child, or the child who's about to be baptized or about to be confirmed, that they're supposed to help stand in the place of the parents should the need arise, in order to help that child grow up to be a good Christian. Okay? Now, in marriage, again, in a pious society like the Philippines, we'd like to think of the ninong and ninang to be good examples for this life project that this young couple is embarking on, which is their marriage and the family that will happen afterwards. But again, strictly speaking, that's not their job. By law, that's not their job. As a matter of fact, ninong and ninang in plural sponsors, it doesn't even enter in canon law. What enters is there must be 2 witnesses. And only the names of those 2 will appear. So if you have a dozen sponsors there, they won't appear anywhere in the registry, because only 2 witnesses are required, both in the church wedding, the canonical marriage, and in the civil contract that's going to be submitted to City Hall. Only 2 witnesses for that. Okay, next. So what happens with a declaration of nullity, which is what is going to be the object of all these formations, prejudicial marriage counselors? The first thing that we have to affirm is there's no such thing as an annulment in the Catholic Church, because an annulment would be tantamount to divorce. What God has put together, if He has really put them together, if there's really a valid marriage, there's no power on earth that can break it. What we have in church instead is what we call a declaration of nullity. What is that? What is that? It is a declaration by the competent ecclesiastical authority, always through a judicial process, never just an administrative one or a summary process, always a judicial process, which is the most thorough process there is in law, that declares that a given marriage, hitherto presumed valid, was in fact invalid from the start. Why? Due to a defect in any of the 3 factors, the 3 pillars that we enumerated earlier. If any of those three pillars were defective or even absent, then you can say that juridically there was no marriage. And that's the reason why there's no annulment. There's nothing to annul. You annul a valid marriage, you annul it. But precisely what we're saying is in the Catholic Church, in natural law for that matter, not just the church, you cannot annul a marriage if it's valid. Why? Because of those qualities that we said before. One of the qualities or essential properties of marriage is that it's indissoluble. Nobody can solve it. Indissoluble, so nobody can break it. That's what indissoluble means. In Latin, solure means to dissolve. You cannot dissolve a marriage. You cannot make it fall apart. No. So what are these three factors again? Number one, the incapacity to contract. So if through a process you demonstrate and you prove beyond reasonable doubt that there was an impediment, or that there was that psychological incapacity, which is the 13th reason there, then that's a ground for declaring the marriage null. By the way, it has to be declared. No, not even the conviction of any of the spouses, or if there were an advocate, not even that conviction that a marriage or there was an incapacity on the part of any one of either of the spouses, not even that can constitute the nullity of a marriage. It has to be declared by a court, by the proper tribunal. And then second is a defective consent. If again, it's demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt through a trial, through a process, that there was no consent, or if it was defective, then that could be a ground for the declaration of nullity. And finally, something very straightforward that I always say, if this still fails, it's katangahan already, no? Or negligence on the part of the people who should have been on top of it, is the lack of canonical form. And we will study what are the things that put up or make up the canonical form. As I said earlier, if you got married in Cavite, in Tagaytay, and the priest who married you there didn't have the dispensation, the delegation from your own parish, since you came from Green Meadows or you came from Quezon City. So, principally, you should have gotten married in your own parish. But if you get married anywhere else, that priest who's going to do that must have a delegation from your parish. Why is that important? Because in principle, only your own parish priest, the one where you are staying, knows you enough to guarantee or to vouchsafe that you are in the correct dispositions and are ready for getting married. That priest there in Tagaytay or anywhere else, he doesn't know you from Adam or from Eve. So therefore, how does he guarantee that that marriage is in fact valid or in fact sincere or well thought out? No. So that's the reason for that. So without that dispensation, then you got married, or dispensation, delegation, then you got married in a place where nobody knows you. And then that what happens there is what you have heard. Now, what happens in Las Vegas, it stays in Las Vegas. So one fine weekend in Las Vegas, and the people get married there before the justice of the peace, and just as easily break it afterwards because it was not really thought out thoroughly. So in church, that cannot happen, no? Because in principle, you don't get married in Las Vegas. You get married in your parish with your parish priest knowing you. And if you get married somewhere else, he must have that somewhere else the delegation, which means to say that you first approach your parish priest, who first interviewed you and found out for himself that you in fact were ready to get married. That only after that, he will send the opportune delegation to that other priest. Okay, puede, you can officiate that marriage. Without that, then that thing is invalid. Okay? Now, what is the role of the prejudicial marriage counselor? Your role, if you pass this course. We read that in that document that I mentioned earlier, coming from the Roman Rota, the Supreme Court of the Catholic Church. It says, this path of accompanying will aid in overcoming in a more satisfying manner matrimonial crisis, plural. But it is also called to verify in concrete cases the validity or non-validity of the marriage and to gather the material useful for the eventual judicial process, be it the ordinary or the briefer one. So that's what you're supposed to do in accompanying a problematic marriage to determine the validity or non-validity of the marriage and to gather the necessary material. Note, you're not going to declare the sentence that it was invalid, but you know enough to say, yeah, puede, no? Maybe there's an invalidity here. And it's your job, it would be your job then, number one, to help them write the case. It's called the case history. It's the most important document that begins a process. And two, to fill out the necessary pro forma petition asking a competent court to start the process for the declaration of nullity. Now, as you can see, any ordinary couple there, any ordinary problematic union will not know what to do. Even you right now, with what you've heard so far, you have an inkling of how the process can be started, but you don't yet know the specifics. Only at the end of this course, you will be in a position to do that. Do what? Help a couple file a case for the declaration of nullity. Okay? So the purpose of the prejudicial investigation then, continuing, such an investigation will serve to gather useful elements for the eventual introduction of a judicial process, ordinary or briefer, on the part of the spouses, possibly also by a joint petition for nullity or through some canonically prepared persons before the bishop or the competent tribunal. Such an investigation concludes with the drafting of a request or libellus, as it's called technically, to be submitted, if appropriate, to the competent authority. Okay, so that's the, tamang-tama, it's 4 o'clock. So I will entertain some questions and we can call it a day. Chrissy, can you unmute yourself?
Father, the question from the previous class that was that was not asked because it was sent to me privately.
Mm-hmm.
The question is about adoption. Will it also be unacceptable for the same reasons as implantation, or is it different? Because adopting a child is not strictly from the conjugal love or marital embrace of the infertile parents.
Okay. Adopting a child is an entirely different thing. So what is wrong with IVF is the bringing about of a new human being through a process which is not the conjugal embrace of his parents. Here, you already have a child, it's already existing, and you're doing a great thing adopting that child. There's nothing wrong with that. That's very right.
Mm-hmm.
No? It's laudable, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
You're giving a homeless child, an orphan child, or a parentless child, you're giving that child a family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then there's another question here, but it might have been answered already. It's about the canonical form. What does the delegation look like? Is it the engaged couple who must secure the delegation, or is it done parish to parish?
Now, actually, it's okay. It's done parish to parish. But if you were, if I'm going to get married, well, of course not me, no. If you were to get married, I'd look into it to make sure that it was done, because people are so careless, and sometimes years ago I had confronted a case where people got married in Calaruega. Imagine, it's a nice place there owned by the Dominicans. And then when I asked, but who's marrying you? Another visiting priest from their friend from Manila. So was it registered anywhere? We don't know. And in fact, what happened was it wasn't. Because in that particular case, since the marriage took place, where did it take place? In Calaruega. So where should that be registered? Not in Green Meadows or wherever they came from in the NCR. It should be registered in the place where it took place, where the marriage took place. And that place happens to belong to a parish in Cavite. But they never told the priest in the parish in Cavite. Why? Because the priest that they brought came from Paco or from wherever he came from. And there was no proper patay, adding one boo-boo to another. So that marriage was not registered anywhere. So 5 years afterwards, they were looking for their marriage certificate because they wanted to enroll their child, or maybe 7 years afterwards, and there was nothing.
Mhm.
Marriage certificate from City Hall, maybe they had that, but the certificate that they were married in church, nothing. So that marriage was not registered in the Catholic Church. So in the Catholic Church, they're not married.
Yes. Father, is there time for one more question? There's one more question that came up. Will a prejudicial investigation fly if the first spouse of the husband will not cooperate in a petition for nullity?
Yes, definitely. The law has a life of its own. Now, what happens in a process is that wife will be summoned, and she will be summoned twice or thrice, as a matter of fact, total of 3 times. But if she doesn't reply to those summons, to that call to trial, then the procedure will move forward with her side not represented. So it will all be on the basis of what the party that filed it, the petitioner, is saying, plus his witnesses. Of course, it cannot be just in his say so, right? He will have to corroborate his claim. But there will be no chance because you see, it's like this. For those of you who are not lawyers there, why did we say earlier that for a marriage, it will always have to be through a judicial process? Because the so-called judicial process as a process is characterized by what is called the judicial contestorium or controversy. That if it's not judicial, what will it be? Documentary, you just submit documents, or administrative. That the one who's going to dispense justice is the one who will investigate it by himself, or he may ask some witnesses also, or some whatever sources. Okay, that looks like it's accurate enough. But if you really want it to be accurate, you go through a judicial process, because a judicial process is that process where every step there is a chance for the controversy. There's no free lunch in a judicial process. Everything you say, there's another party that can say otherwise. And it's even his duty to try to shoot it down. And this is the human attempt at infallibility. No, infallibility, nobody's infallible, right? Only God is infallible, and the Pope, because of the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But everybody else is fallible. Now, how do you guarantee as infallible as possible for a case so important as marriage? By having each one have his day in court. In other words, whatever one says, the other one can shoot down. But of course, in the end, they will have to have sufficient arguments and sufficient witnesses and proofs to prove the point. But that's what the judicial process is. That's the reason why I always tell people, sometimes you see people there, why, like my friend Fortun, some people attack him. Why do you defend these crooks? Because remember, Sig Fortun is famous for defending questionable personages. But actually, if he doesn't do it, you cannot have a trial. A trial, there must be a contest. You cannot have a trial where one is agreeing, sige na nga, guilty ako. Well, that's a confession. There won't be a trial there. A real trial, there must be a contest. And each side must put up an argument. And normal people don't know how to put up that argument. That's why they need a lawyer. So that a lawyer who defends crooks is doing the justice system a favor. Because that's another thing. Because at that stage, you cannot say he's a crook. A crook is not a crook until proven beyond reasonable doubt that he's a crook. No, that's the presumption of law of the innocence of a party. So that even somebody who says, but don't you see that he's guilty? Well, no, until the judge has said so, until the sentence has come out, we cannot say he's guilty. It just seems he's guilty. But precisely, I'm trying to have the truth come out by defending his side of it. That's a big favor to the justice system. Otherwise, there can be no justice. The wheels of justice cannot turn without that position of the controversy, which is made possible by the defense of the supposedly accused. Kaya nga accused lang. It's not yet proven. Okay, that's how this thing works. Anything else?
There's another question, Father. I don't know if there's still more time, but it might be answered in a future class.
I'll tell you whether it will be answered in a future class.
Okay. Will impotence be still considered as an impediment if the both parties are aware of it before the wedding and they have given their consent despite the impotence of one of the parties?
Okay, that will be answered in a future class.
Okay, sige, Father.
Please remember to ask it again.
Yes. And then just a brief question. How long does the declaration of nullity process usually last?
Okay, the law says 6 months.
6 months. Mm-hmm.
What the law
Okay.
says. But one thing is what the law says, another thing is what actually happens. No? In a functioning, well-run tribunal, like what happens in the Diocese of Cubao, it may take 6 months. Probably it will take 1 year. And in many other tribunals where precisely because of what I said, there are no advocates, the judges have to do everything, it may actually take longer than that. So ballpark figure for good processes, good tribunals, 2 years. If there's a backlog, wow, I just was given a case that had been transferred from another court and it had been there for 20 years. And finally, when we said, yeah, we can pursue this, it's very clear. Well, they couldn't get in touch with the person anymore. They have disappeared. So, I don't know what happened there, no?
Okay. In my experience, the ninongs and ninangs sign as witnesses. Is this a wrong practice?
Yeah, it's a wrong practice. Maybe they sign as witnesses in the certificate, the civil marriage, but in church that won't happen.
Okay, sige. I
Because
think they're
other things, there's no space in the registry for people.
Yeah. So I think there. Wait, there's I thought there was one more question. Okay, so I don't think there's any more question, Father. Somebody just thanked us. Thank you, Father Jim and Miss Chrissy. You're welcome. It's a pleasure. And there's some announcements. I think there's some people who have a hard time accessing the Google Classroom. From their technical support, it says that you must use your personal Gmail and not an institutional email. If that still does not work, we need to add you manually to the Google Classroom so you can post your personal Gmail address here. So only the teachers, either Father Jim or I, can add you to the class. So please post or please message us in private your personal Gmail account, so email address, so we can add you to the classroom.
Okay.
Yes, I think that's all.
With that, I look forward to seeing all of you again on Saturday. Yes. And in case there are other people who want to join the class, because I think we're now 54 people and there's actually space for 100, they can still join, no? If you know of anyone, and they'll just have to manage with the readings and your explanations of what they have made so far, because they haven't missed very much yet. They can still catch up, no? But after the next class, next session on Saturday, I don't think they can profit of profitably join anymore, no? And they will just
Yes.
have to be.
Will the recording of this class be uploaded, Father, to the Google Classroom?
Yes, it will be. No? This class has been recorded and it will be uploaded. The only thing is those files normally are kind of humongous, but if you have the technical capability of doing that, then definitely,
Will the recording be uploaded, Father?
yes, we will. We will upload it. Okay, so until Saturday then, in the same way that we began this class with a prayer, let us end this class with a prayer. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening.